Hot Days by Griffin Rose on AO3. Episode 12, Chapter 2. First Week of School. Dad! Shouta had already caught on. What's going on? Kirishima asked. Is it starting already? Kaminari asked. People poured out of the void. 5, 10, 20, more. So many. It was never ending. They couldn't get a signal out. The villain said something about All Might. All of you get back, Shouta ordered. He used his hero voice. Izuku already knew things were serious, but now he was absolutely certain. Those are villains, Shouta stated, sliding his goggles into place. And this is real. Oh, wait, Dad, there's too many, Izuku cried, running forward. He knew Shouta would jump in and give them time to escape, but he was one person, and his quirk wasn't suited for this kind of fighting. Shouta glanced back at him, hesitating for only half a second. I love you, Izuku. 13. Protect the students. And then he jumped down to meet the villains. Izuku tried to go after him, but Koda held him back. There was an explosion and yelling behind him, and then the black void surrounded him. When it cleared, it was falling. He morphed into a sparrow before he crashed into the asphalt, but strong winds almost sent him careering into a building. Rain soaked his feathers in seconds, and he morphed at the last second into a frog to stick to the building, carefully climbing down. He found Tokoyami and Koda down there, and a group of villains were quickly surrounding him. He morphed back into a human, still crouched back to back with his classmates. The only good thing about the situation was that if some of the villains were in the squirrel zone with them, then it was that many less villains had to fight with his dad. Koda whimpered behind him. The villains, sensing scared and weak prey, grinned and laughed, slowing their approach. Hold on, Tokoyami said, dark shadow grabbing onto Izuku and Koda with one large shadowy wing. The other wing latched onto a lamppost and pulled them out of the tightening ring of villains. We need to get out of here, Dark Shadow yelled. Izuku agreed, but he looked back at the villains. If they escaped, the villains would only chase them, and then his dad would have to fight them. We should make sure they can't follow us. Any suggestions? Tokoyami asked. Izuku glanced around, looking for inspiration. Without knowing what all the villains' quirks were, it was hard to know what would effectually trap them. He'd love to be able to walk out the doors and drop something on the other side, pinning them in. But if any of them had a strength quirk, that wouldn't last seconds. He glanced at the villains again. Against multiple opponents, he did have one trick he could use. This probably wouldn't take all of them out, but if he could take some of them and then trap the rest somehow, they would be in a much better position. Set me down. I have an idea, Izuku said. Be careful, Dark Shadow chirped, lowering him back to the ground. Izuku faced off against villains. They slowed as they approached him, probably wondering what the hell he was doing. He wondered that all the time. It used to take him a long time to morph into bigger animals, but now it hardly took him any time at all. In seconds, he was changing into a Rhinoceros. He heard one of them swear before he knocked them aside. He bolted quite over a few, and anyone he didn't hit get up very fast. There were plenty that they evaded him, though, and he charged back at them down again. While their attention was focused on him, Dark Shadow was able to grab a handful of them and toss them around the zone. Koda played with the damsel in distress, goaded a few into chasing him around the block, which meant that they were all in a cluster for Dark Shadow to pick off when he came back. Izuku morphed into a bird to fly over a few remaining villains, and then he morphed into an elephant to land on them. They probably hadn't gotten every single villain in the zone, but they'd taken care of enough. He was more than worried about his dad. Morphing into a cheetah, he called for Koda and told them that it was time to go. Koda relayed the order to Tokoyami, and they caught up with him when he morphed back into a human at the doors to shove his way from the plaza. It wasn't a pretty sight. Dozens of villains were scattered unconsciously over the floor, and Shouta was still fighting. His arm was bloody, the sleeve around his elbow gone. As Izuku watched, a large, monstrous-looking thing came out of nowhere and slammed his dad into the ground. "No!" Izuku yelled, morphing again and racing forwards as a cheetah. "Midoriya, don't!" Koda yelled. The villain with hands all over him laughed and spread his arms, opening himself for an attack. "Such loyalty, Eraserhead. But all for nada. No mu." The big villain cut Izuku off, a giant fist racing down to crunch his skull. Izuku morphed into a rhino again and attempted to plow through him. It lifted Izuku easily and flipped him, slamming his back into the ground. Izuku morphed back into human, completely wounded. "This one should make a good example of All Might." "The hands," villain said, slowly stalking towards him. "Don't touch him!" Shouta growled it out, stumbling to his feet. Blood ran down his sides of his face, and his right arm was mangled beyond use. Shigaraki paused and turned toward him. "Is this brat special to you or something?" "Izuku, get out of here!" Shouta ordered. Izuku rolled onto his stomach and tried to push himself up, but the Nomu put a foot on his back and pushed him to the ground. "First name basis," Shigaraki noticed. "He is special to you. Then I guess you won't mind surrendering, or my Nomu will crush his rib cage." The weight on his back increased, and Izuku struggled to breathe. Shouta gritted between Izuku and Shigaraki, and then he started to raise his left hand. "No!" Izuku gasped out. He craned his neck back to glare at Nomu and morphed into an elephant, something too big for the Nomu to crush, underfoot. He slammed his tusk into Nomu and continued to push him back. "Nomu, kill the brat." Hands wrapped around his tusk, the Nomu stopped him in his tracks, then twisted Izuku sideways, nearly ripping his tusk out. When Izuku fell, he morphed into a snake, and wound his way by Nomu's arm, until he could wrap around Nomu's neck. And then he constricted. Nomu ripped him off, and Izuku was quick to morph into a turtle before Nomu could start twisting the more fragile Spectre body. Shouta cried out. Izuku peered out of his shell to see his dad sporting a new wound on his right arm. With a transformation quirk to a Kazuto, Izuku bounced off of the Nomu and launched himself at Shigaraki, morphing mid-jump into a tiger, claws and teeth bared. Shigaraki raised bare hands to defend himself. "No! Don't let him touch you!" Shouta yelled. Izuku pulled back just in time, taking up a defended position in front of Shouta and growling at Shigaraki. Nomu prowled up to join them. Shouta faced Nomu, left hand weakly controlling his capture weapon. "I'm bored with this. Nomu, take care of Eraserhead. I'll handle the brat." Before Shouta could protest, he was slammed into the ground again. His goggles broke this time, snapping under the force and flying into the air. Izuku roared. When Shigaraki came at him, he leaped aside and twisted back, swiping down Shigaraki's back. Shigaraki howled and turned on his heel to slap a hand on Izuku's head. They stood there for a second, both kind of surprised at the lack of anything. Then Shigaraki laughed and looked over his shoulder. "You really are so cool, Eraserhead." Behind them, Shouta had managed to turn his head just enough to glare at them. It was the last thing he did, because Nomu slammed his head into the ground again, and he didn't move after that. Izuku roared, swiping at Shigaraki and catching him in the thin of time. He danced back, hands lifting from Izuku's head. A shadow shoved him sideways after that. Dark Shadow saluted Izuku. Tokoyami and Koda were hurdled in bushes, bravely stepping forward to help. Growling, Shigaraki retrained his balance and ordered Nomu after them again. A long bang echoed through the USJ before the Nomu moved, and they all paused to see that it was All Might stepping into view, ripping off his tie. The next 10 minutes passed by a blur, but they also felt like they took forever. All Might was able to defeat the Nomu. His classmates helped stop Kirigiri, and Izuku escort Tokoyami, Dark Shadow, and his dad up the front of the building. Shouta wasn't waking up, and Izuku was losing his mind. There was so much blood, and he could see the muscles in Dad's elbow. That wasn't good. That was terrible. He didn't think of the night his mother told him to run very often. But this felt like that night. His dad was hurt, and Izuku couldn't help him. He was going to be left alone again, without anyone to understand him. Shouta had been his pillar for 7 years. Izuku doesn't know where he'd be without it, and he was terrified to find out. When the rest of the UA facility got there, Izuku barely noticed. He hovered over his dad, crying, begging him to wake up. He missed the pros taking down the villains, missed the arrival of the paramedics. He didn't miss the paramedics taking his dad away. Hisashi had to physically bar him from chasing after them, and Izuku buried his face in Hisashi's chest. Hisashi shushed him, running his hands through Izuku's hair. They'll take care of him. It'll be okay. Izuku shook his head wordlessly. Nothing about this was okay. How could Hisashi lie to him like that? Shh, Izuku. I've got you. It'll be okay. He felt like the Nomu was standing on his back again. He could barely breathe. It's crap. Okay, hang on. There was a moment of vertigo where Izuku didn't know what way was up, and then he was cradled in Hisashi's arms. Is he okay? Uraraka asked out of sight. Why did he transform? Hisashi rubbed behind his ears and sighed. He does this when he gets really stressed. Seeing his dad like that. He didn't finish explaining, but no one asked him to, so it must have been obvious. Nezu gave the two of them permission to go to the hospital, and Hisashi rushed out without another word. Izuku stayed as a cat. Emotions were less overwhelming as an animal. Why his default animal was always a cat? Izuku didn't know. Even in fights, he intended to pick felines, unless he needed specific traits of another animal. Whatever the reason, he stayed as a cat while waiting in the hospital. Different nurses kept trying to kick him out, and Hisashi had to consistently explain that it was just his quirk and that they were waiting for updates on his dad. They never had updates, and Izuku did his best to disappear into Hisashi's leather coat. Yeah, okay. 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 Well, that was a little less angsty than I thought it was gonna be. But okay. 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 Okay, as always, my brain drops. Make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Link to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.